Good evening. My name is Michael Cochran. I'm the executive director of the Market House Theater. When Bobby Wrinkle asked me to do this, to talk about the Market House Theater, I have been a part of the American Association of Community Theater, the national board. And after we did our project downtown, I had so many other theaters that said, "How did you do that? Can you help share some of those ideas?" So they set up for me to do a master class on how to turn a downtown project or a bunch of buildings into a cultural center. So this is part of the program tonight, is part of that presentation I gave. So some of my slides are from that. And my first slide was, so you want to renovate a city block of old buildings into a theater campus without any debt. My next one was, or how I made every mistake you can make and learned from them. Which is true. You start out with an idea, and then you have a vision, and then you move forward with that. And somebody's asked me, did you have all this in mind? Did you see how this was going to be, when you first started? And I said, absolutely not. I had no idea what it was going to turn into, but I knew the direction I was headed. And as long as we kept heading in that direction, we knew we were making progress with some things. So just a little bit of background history on this. Market House Theater was founded in 1963 to save the historic Market House building from becoming a parking lot. And the city's population was about 27,000 at that time. The building is 1 block long, sits in the middle of Market House Square, 2nd Street, and it's 30 feet wide. And I remember the first time I pulled up to interview for a job at the Market House, I pulled up in front of the end of the Market House and I looked at that building and I thought, where did they put a theater in this building? So the theater occupies half of that whole building with a museum and an art gallery at the other end. It seated 250 people at the time with a proscenium stage and a tiny lobby with a women's restroom with 2 stalls and a men's room with 1 stall. And people would ask me, how long is intermission? And I would say, as long as the line to the women's restroom. So for the first 20 years, the theater produced about 4 to 5 plays each year. So when I came in 1983, it was the 20th anniversary. I was hired at the 20th anniversary of the theater. And I went back and counted the shows, and in that first 20 years, the theater produced 100 productions over 20 years. Sets were built on the stage. We had 2 small dressing rooms backstage, a donated or rented storage space for our scenery. And every 5 years, we would ask people to donate space. It'd be like, well, we need our space back. So then we'd have to find another space for storage. And in 1983, the budget was $75,000 and had a staff of 2 full-time people and 1 part-time person. I was one of the full-time people. I was hired as the technical director designer. So I did costumes, sets, lights, props, built all of that. And then there was an executive director and then a part-time box office person. From 1983 to 1993, the theater expanded to doing 8 to 10 shows a year and added educational classes. When we came here, I came here, and my girlfriend from college, we were both working in Kansas City, and theater was kind of like you go different places, different jobs lead you different places. And I got a job offer from Paducah. Never heard of Paducah before. And it was a little community theater. I'd never worked in community theater before. And when I got the job offer, I turned to my girlfriend, April, my college girlfriend, and said, hey, do you want to move to Paducah and get married, and we'll try it for 2 years? This is my 41st year with the Market House Theater. So April in 1985 was hired to replace the guy who hired me. They did a nationwide search and they decided to hire a new executive director. So April was hired, and April immediately began doing children's theater, educational theater, because she was passionate about that. And with the 2 of us, we were passionate about creating theater. So the theater started doing more and more shows each year. I got to make sure my slides keep up with what I'm talking about. We decided to expand. After 10 years, we decided to expand and began the Second Stage project. And this was a capital campaign to renovate 3 empty buildings across the street from the theater. All the buildings were historic buildings that had been bought by the Pedders Supply Company, but they couldn't tear them down and they weren't suitable to renovate for warehouse space. The 120 Market House Square, which is the far building on the bottom left, was an Army surplus store. The roof had fallen in on it and had been condemned, and you could stand in the first floor and look up at the clouds above it. 122 was the building next door with the red corrugated tin front on that. The front of that building had fallen off in the late 70s because the building next door had burned, and they removed that building, but they also removed the support point for the front of the building next door. So one day, I am told, the front of the building fell off into Market House Square. So they put up that red tin front on it. The 132 building, which is the end building down here on the bottom, that building was empty. It had been a clothing store, it had been various things, and you can see part of the construction that was happening on that. The other buildings on the block were leaning on that building, and that was holding up the building. So I had a great contractor, Ray Black & Son, who figured it out. We tore out the bottom section of that building, rebuilt it with steel, and then put the brick back over it, so that building now holds up half a block. When we went to do those buildings, we worked with the Pedders Supply Company and to acquire the buildings for $1 because they couldn't do what they wanted to with it. And we worked with the city, who gave land to the landlocked supply company downtown and moved them into the industrial park. It was a win-win situation for us and for them. And what it turned out to be was a win for Market House Square because the other buildings became Etc. Coffee House, Kirchhoff's Bakery came back, Max's Brick Oven. All those buildings were a part of Pedders Supply, and because Market House Theater needed room, that started all that chain reaction to do that. We were the first ones to start the project. Because of trying to fundraise and everything else, we were the last ones to finish the project. So we decided we would make the Army surplus building a studio theater with a classroom upstairs. The red tin fronted building next door would be a scene shop downstairs, dressing rooms and education upstairs. The corner building would be the box office downstairs, costume shop upstairs, 2 apartments for staff, and retail space at the back. And we could lease out that retail space for income. So we worked with Ray Black & Son to create drawings based on the building sizes and created a brochure of our proposed spaces, and we announced a capital campaign to raise $1.25 million to the public. And you can see some of the drawings for the second stage project. Wherever you see on my slide something with red, that's a mistake I made. So we created drawings based on the building sizes we had to start moving forward. I didn't know it was a mistake at the time. None of us did. But I learned later on from doing this where certain things that you start doing and then you go, oh, that's not how you do a campaign like this. We announced our campaign and began fundraising. The board president and I made the first donations to the project. We anticipated we would raise the rest of the funds as we worked on the buildings. We anticipated staffing up and covering the additional costs out of new income from the use of the new spaces once they were completed. We were able to raise about half of the $1.25 million and then began construction and took out a loan for the remaining construction costs. We anticipated we would raise the rest of the funds as we worked on the buildings. The building project took longer than we had planned. The building cost more than we had planned. It cost an additional $500,000 more from a $1.25 million budget. The buildings were completed. So you can see the front, that was the corrugated tin front, is on the far left. You can see that the back of the 120 and 122, where we put a parking lot behind that, the corner building, the 132 building, and then on the far right here is the side of that 132 where we had, it was an investment office back there, but the 2 apartments upstairs. So after we completed the buildings, the money stopped coming in. A new performing arts center was announced for across the street from us. The economy went into a recession. We weren't able to hire the staff we needed, and the bank loan began draining the theater's resources. We almost went broke trying to pay off the note. We called our top donors to a meeting and asked them for advice. They not only gave us advice, they helped us pay off the remaining bank loan, but they wanted a guarantee that if they helped us, we wouldn't go right back into debt. The economy improved and we started to grow again. We kept our large donor advisor group and called them the trustee committee. They had no real power, but we met with them once a year and we gave an update on the status of the theater. 10 years later, we had outgrown our second stage spaces. Our studio theater was too small. It would seat 80 people. We had put that in there so we could do educational shows. Well, when you have 25 to 30 kids in a cast, and they want mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and all the brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and neighbors, you run out of seats real fast. And we learned that we were having to turn people away because we didn't have enough seats. We couldn't do enough shows, we couldn't do enough seats for the parents to see the kids perform in what we were doing. Also, if you wanted to exit stage right on the stage, facing an audience, stage right is that way. If you wanted to exit stage right and then enter from stage left, you had to run through the building behind it, go outside the building, come back in through the front door to get back on stage. We needed more classroom space. Our primary classroom wasn't accessible by a wheelchair. It was upstairs. We didn't have any storage space in the new buildings. The scene shop was too small to build scenery to get ahead of the immediate show we were working on. We could build a piece of scenery, but if we couldn't move it on stage, we couldn't build anything else in the space. The costume shop was not accessible at all. Costumes had to be carried up and down a flight of stairs. How could we expand our operations again without making the same mistakes we made the first time? We looked for guidance, and I found this study called Set in Stone by the University of Chicago. And let's see, I just want to share this video because this was such a great video to help me see what we needed to do.
When famed Chicago architect Daniel Burnham said, "Make no little plans," he knew how to rally support. And yet too often, plans for big cultural building projects seem to go wildly off course. Now, research from the Cultural Policy Center at the University of Chicago helps us see how this happens and what we can do better to realize those big dreams. How is it that extremely smart people get together and so often make decisions that in hindsight look a bit crazy? This is the question that separates handshakes and high fives from empty auditoriums. Whether you're considering any large capital project, be it a brand new building or a seemingly modest addition to your existing facility. Now let's look at how big dreams develop. You start out with a rational process. You have good reasons why you want a new building. Perhaps you need more space for conservation work, better parking, better seating, an improved performance space, a location closer to your customers, more practice space, or more space for education. All seemingly rational, compelling reasons why something new and bigger is better for your organization and your community. So you start down the path of creating a new facility. You start raising money and working on feasibility studies, figuring how much demand exists and moving ahead. But what the research shows is that as you engage your board, motivate your donors, excite the community, what starts out as a rational process quickly becomes an emotional one. Emotional because you're talking about vision, posterity, reputation, about donor relationships and big, big gifts. You're creating a legacy for the next generation based on mission, art, civic pride. In other words, all those things that fuel the passion everyone feels for the organization in the first place. And you're sharing your vision with many different people, board members, government, staff, consultants, reporters, all with varying beliefs and approaches. The emotional kindling is in place. And now you add all the outside advisors, architects, consultants, campaign advisors. Well, they bring in expertise that you need to embark on the project, which is the reason you engage them in the first place. They make this whole process more complex as well. And remember, generally speaking, these outside advisors are better off if a project goes forward. The longer the project runs, the more money they earn. It's not that they're trying to take advantage of you, but their incentives are not perfectly aligned with yours, all of which leaves you with a highly challenging set of relationships to manage. The outside advisors are necessary, but they too add emotional complexity. Here you are, in the middle of this emotional process, and some facts may come to light that aren't positive for the project, which we already know from the research is exactly what will happen. Your project will run over budget. Not maybe, it will. Your schedule will run behind. Not maybe, it will. Some of the key players you're counting on will leave you. And what about the economic and political environment around you? That's definitely going to change during this process. We know this for sure. So now the evidence is piling up against the project, and you think, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Okay, I'm going to stop now. We're going to step away from the idea of a new building. But you're forgetting how long the building process usually takes. On average, almost 10 years. In relationship terms, you've been dating for a really long time. This is an intense relationship you're in. You've been through a lot together. You've talked about hundreds of millions of dollars, spent hundreds of hours together. You're bonded. You're a team. You're in this together. And now you're talking about breaking up. And not just with one person. You're in the relationship with 30, 40, 50 people who don't want you to break up with them. And now it's your job to break up with everyone. Who wants to do that? Who wants to play that role? We know from studies of decision making that human nature naturally pushes us towards staying the course, toward discounting the evidence we see that goes against the path we've chosen. Our innate optimism, desire to avoid conflict, and tendency to make incremental but ever-increasing commitments pushes us towards continuing down the same path. What can you do to make sure that when you finish this journey, you're on the winning side? That you have avoided making the two most common mistakes that our research shows people make over and over again in cultural building projects. Number one, underestimating your operating costs after the project is finished. And number two, overestimating your ability to raise revenue to support it. So should we just make little plans? No need. By asking 4 questions at every step along a big project, big decision path, you can increase the likelihood that your big plans will become a successful reality. First, is this still supporting our mission? In other words, is this big project as it evolves still going to do what we exist to do? Is there genuine organizational need? Next, are we building the capacity to manage this new project when we're finished? In other words, when our project is complete, will we have the people and resources to make the most of the opportunities it offers us? Is the leadership in place, both board and staff, to lead this more complex organization through a successful transition? Third, do we have the money we need, when we need it, for the entire project? Delay is expensive. Uncertainty is even costlier. Are we confident that the demand actually is there, and not just imagined, that will provide a growing body of contributors and supporters in the years to come? Finally, do we have a broad community that will be served by the facility, now and in the future? If we spend this much money, will it benefit many rather than just a few? These questions seem simple, ordinary, and logical when you start, but asking them repeatedly is rare because it's a complicated, sometimes thankless task. And yet answering them thoughtfully, while keeping the process as rational as you can, is the best way to execute your big plans.
All right, so we saw that video, and it reminded me so much of some of the things that we had done in our first capital campaign, the second stage project. And everything he said comes to pass. And if you're prepared for it, then it's a whole different experience. So we began what would come to be called the next stage project in 2007. We had outgrown the expansion project we did in 1996. The theater needed more space, and we either needed to expand or cut back. The most popular item we talked about expanding in 2007 was expanded restrooms in the main theater. That's the thing that would be the most visible to donors besides a larger children's studio theater. We also needed additional classrooms, rehearsal space, scene shop, and costume shop spaces. I cannot tell you how important restrooms are in every project you do. They are a critical piece of whatever you're going to do. We went to our trustee advisory committee to seek advice on doing another expansion. We had bankers on the committee, and they saw trouble on the horizon and suggested we hold off. When your major donors give you advice, you're wise to listen to it. The Great Recession hit in 2008. The project was paused until the economy recovered. This was a lifesaver that we had smart people tell us to hold off. In 2010, the Trustee Advisory Committee recommended moving forward. Getting advice from your major donors is a great step towards asking them for support to do the project because they were involved from the very beginning and gave you advice on it. We began to talk to property owners about selling or donating buildings to us. Nobody would agree to work with us. They asked us all kinds of questions that we didn't have solid answers for. How much will it cost to build this? How are you going to sustain this? How many people have agreed to fund this project? We needed help. I reached out to the Schuler-Shook organization. They're consultants in Chicago, one of the best in the country for theater arts buildings. They're not architects. They don't build things, but they're consultants for that, to ask about expanding. They told me we needed to do a couple of things before we began the project and recommended a different consultant to help us first before they would come in and help us. What I got from Schuler-Shook was, when you are ready, doors will open for you. And don't fall in love with a building. We needed to do our homework, and we needed to know exactly what we really needed. Step one was the organizational assessment. Do you have the right board, staff, community support to do an expansion project? We hired a company called Web Management out of New York to conduct an organizational assessment. They don't do fundraising campaigns or do architectural projects. They are solely an arts business-based consultant. In the results of the assessment, from the board, we learned that we needed to increase our board size from 12 to 18. Our staff increased our fundraising staff to make sure we could handle a campaign. Identify our niche in the community and show broad support for the expanded project. During the consultant process, they met with other community arts groups and business leaders. From the meetings, we discovered that there were other arts groups in town looking for additional arts education space. They would be interested if we offered affordable space in our project. Doing an expansion for just one group is a heavy lift. The more you can use it by multiple groups, it engages additional community support. And we found there were dance and music studios in town that would be interested in leasing space from us with the Next Stage project. This increased the classroom space that we were planning, and yet it helped support the project later on because it attracted more groups. We could utilize shared restrooms and other spaces for multiple programs. It also helped cover the cost of operating the space for utilities and maintenance. You don't build it and they will come. You get them coming now. You beg, borrow, or rent space to get your programming going to prove that you have the demand that you think you do. We approached a dance company to be part of our project, but in the process of discovery, we learned there was a demand for a non-competitive dance model, and our participants wanted to learn dance without expensive recital and competition fees. We created our own small dance program with 2 classes first. We built a temporary dance floor in a building that we already owned but hadn't renovated. By 5 years into the project, we had already surpassed our income goals for the completed project in class fees and created a whole new revenue stream in education, which helped us cover our operational costs before we even started construction. We did a facilities needs assessment. What space and what type of space do you need? We went back to Schuler-Shook, facility consultants, finally ready to do space needs assessment. How many students will be in a classroom? How much storage space do you need for tables and chairs and other classroom materials, and restroom space and janitorial space? How much of that space do you need? How many shows in a theater? What support space do you need to support the programming? How much in catering or front of house space is needed to handle an audience that side? We were able to get a square footage number for this project. The one thing I've learned through this is don't hire an architect first. Figure out what your core space you need to complete your project before you ask an architect to design something. Architects will design what you tell them to. Be careful what you ask for. In our second stage campaign, we went to, did architectural stuff first. And they start with structure and they ask you, what would you like in this space? And we said, well, we want a studio theater space. Great. They helped us create a studio theater space. Their jobs give you what you ask for. they don't look at your overall needs. They look at what you ask them to do. And also, what that means is that if you say, well, it'd be nice if we had a bigger bar service here, they'll add that for you. Every time you add a, it would be nice, you need to ask how much that's going to cost. Each it would be nice costs money. And the lesson learned, architects are valuable later in the process. Now you start looking at how the square footage works with the buildings around you, because we had buildings in mind that we were going to do stuff. That one advice, don't fall in love with a building. Let the square footage needs determine your choices. The city of Paducah offered us the Columbia Theater at one point and the office space next to it for our project. When we laid out the square footage on it, we realized it was too small for what we needed to do. If we had done this with our previous second stage project, we would have realized the buildings we renovated were going to be too small for us to grow in the future. It is so hard not to go, oh, there's a building. Oh, we got an opportunity for a building. Let's move in and we can make this and we can do that. Figure out what you need it to do first. Once we had this information, we identified buildings that would fit our square footage needs. We also had to ask, can this building and the building code support what we wanted to put into this building? Some of the buildings we chose, the answer was no. We would have to do more building than we originally thought. Once we knew the square footage we were looking and the programming we wanted to put into it, we then had to develop a business plan to show we could sustain and operate the new spaces. We went back to web management and asked them to conduct this study. How many shows could we program in a new studio theater? What was the seating capacity? How many rentals would we need to support the theater? What was realistic demand for audiences and students to make the new spaces break even? What was a realistic number for utilities and maintenance for all the new spaces? What would staffing cost? How much in contributed and earned income would we need to break even? Now that we had the answers to the building questions and the cost, we needed to answer how much money we could raise. We hired a professional fundraising consultant to do a feasibility study. Professional fundraisers can ask people questions that you can't about their giving intentions. We made clear that we wanted to know what we were facing. Our facility consultant used the square footage and construction costs at the time and told us we had a $12.5 million project. We hired a fundraising consultant to conduct that study. They added a $2 million endowment to that amount and tested a $14.5 million project. Our supporters told us we were crazy. Are you kidding me? $14.5 million? I just can't see that at all. And I went back and I told the fundraising people, I'm not getting very positive feedback on this. They said, don't worry about it. Okay, I'm trusting you on this. They concluded the study and told us they thought we could raise $6 to $7 million on our community project. When we later announced that we were raising $6 million from the people in the study, they all said, oh, that's so much more realistic than 14.5. I felt like if we had said we were going to raise $7 million to start with and they came back with $4 million, they would have gone, oh, that's so much more realistic. It is listening to people that is important when you're starting to move forward with these projects. I was so fortunate to have a couple of board members who asked really hard questions. And that is something that every board needs to have, somebody who's going to ask you the tough things. Remember that video Set in Stone? Even with our best information efforts, we were optimistic about the amount of money to come in and build it. It felt like we were overestimating the amount of money to cover the expenses. People were trusting me to tell them those numbers were correct because I helped work on those numbers. And I wanted them to be correct so badly because I wanted to do the project. But my gut was telling me they were optimistic. They had projected that we would double the number of people coming to the Market House Theater every 2 to 3 years in this project. And looking back, nobody anticipated COVID. Nobody anticipated so many other things that video said things will happen, things will change. And because we said, oh, this feels really optimistic to me, we then went back again. Hard choice. Information comes to light that is detrimental to the project. Our fundraising feasibility study said we could conservatively raise $6 to $7 million. It was a big stretch to raise 12.5. Our project was projected at 12.5. I had people asking me, can we move forward on the 12.5 project? Do you think we can raise the rest of the money? And the board looked to me for an answer. And I remember sitting in my office with contractors and lots of other people and going, so are we a go with this project? And that part of me wanted to go, yes. And I said, no. And I felt like I was breaking up with part of the project. But what it forced us to do was to go back and remember that what's the important thing in the mission? What can we accomplish with $6 to $7 million? And the lesson I learned from that is the funding informs the project. You don't create something and then have these big dreams and then go, oh, we'll make that, we'll make that. You go, how much money do we actually have? How can we do this? Our choices were either to build a $7 million children's theater or to build more classrooms, rehearsal space, scene shop, costume shop at $5 million with a contingency fund. And we chose to move forward with the support spaces because I said, if we build a children's theater, we don't have any classrooms, rehearsal rooms, dressing rooms, or other stuff to help support that. So also in our original plan was to build an outdoor courtyard theater behind 4 of the buildings we owned, the 120 through 126 Market House Square properties. We finally got ready to fundraise. After 3 years of work, we had spent $100,000 total on organizational assessment, facility needs and assessment, and business plan, and fundraising feasibility study. The board spent an additional year debating, can we really do this? They kept asking for more studies and wanted to make sure before we moved forward. Eventually, it was decided we had the information we needed, and we moved. We began a fundraising campaign. Over the course, and I'll come back to this, over the course of 10 years of doing this campaign, our board of directors, each year we would have new board members and we would ask them to support the project. Over that entire course, they supported over $500,000 they contributed. And that was from a group of people, very different economic backgrounds and abilities. So it was amazing what our board came through with. So we are ready to announce our campaign, right? No. First, you ask your board before you tell anyone else you're going to do a campaign. And you have to get 100% board participation to do that. And sometimes that's really hard because if you go to a board member and you say, we need you to support this campaign, would you consider a pledge over 5 years to help support this? And they say, no, I can't do that. Then you have to say, then maybe now is not the right time to serve on the board. Because we have to have 100% in order to go to the public to tell them that we have this support from our own board to do this project. That makes a huge difference when you're fundraising. The other thing I learned is 15 to 20 people will make or break your whole campaign. Those first, after you go to your board, those first 15 to 20 people will motivate and inspire everybody else to follow with that. And that's where the trustee committee can come in. And I can't tell you how, once again, that 100% board contribution is when raising money, because we would walk into a room and I'd say, we have 100% of our board who is contributing to this project. And that motivated all of the asks that we did, because everybody went, okay, you guys are in, I'll consider this. Don't publicly announce a campaign until you've reached at least 50% of your goal. The first project we did, the second stage, we announced we were going to do a fundraising campaign. We hadn't raised a dime. And then we started. And then people all want to see, who's going to be the first ones in? Who am I going to follow in this campaign? So, you know, it took us, we spent almost a year trying to get a $3 million foundation lead gift. That didn't happen. That was a year of effort before we went to anybody else. It took us 2.5 years to get to 50% in our announcement of the campaign project. Many of the people we talked to said, when are you going to do your project? When are you going to announce this? And we would tell them, we're in the quiet phase of our project. We're securing the pieces to be successful. We were now 5 years from the start of, let's do a project, when we made that big announcement. During that time, we also collected 3 years of pledges and had money to begin the project and purchase properties. We never had a single architectural drawing or photoshopped image that I showed donors when we did this project. We told them how many people the project would serve, how many lives would be affected, and how many people that programming would help improve. We had multiple interest points. historic preservation, educational programming, shows, and cultural quality of life. So having those multiple things, I sat in a solicitation meeting with a donor that we were making a big ask for. And I sat down, and it was an older gentleman, not married, didn't have any kids. And I said, we've got this great project, and it's going to do all these educational things. And he said, I don't care about kids. Well, you know, we're doing historic preservation with this project and the cultural part of this project. That's what interested that donor. But, you know, it was having these multiple points for us to be able to talk to people and engage them with what we were going to do with this. Our first building renovation was to add restrooms, and in that initial cost, several years earlier when we'd done the square footage plan, we had put roughly $100,000 for it. It came back at $400,000. Set in stone lesson, things will cost more than you estimated. Our second two buildings, we bought each of the buildings for $70,000, so we spent $140,000. We had a projection with square footage that they would cost $700,000. They came back at $1.4 million. And that's because a lot of things during that process were uncovered in the building process. Some of the walls had to be torn all the way down and rebuilt. Some of the foundations weren't right. We were working with historic buildings. A lot of things happened in that we didn't know until we got into it. As we completed the first two buildings, we went back to the core basics of what we needed to accomplish. We worked with a guaranteed maximum price with our contractor on buildings moving forward. The first couple of buildings, we said, this is what we want. And then they came back and said, okay, this is what it cost. Okay, we need to reverse this. We need to let the money that we have inform what the project is going to be so that the contractor knows, here's how much money you've got to spend, here's what I can give you. In March 13th of 2020, we finished the third set of buildings, the day COVID shut down everything. We had the final and largest set of buildings left to go. I can't tell you, we had dance studios, we had music classrooms, we had this wonderful new building, and nobody could go into it because of COVID. And we had started out the project with trying to design the biggest piece of the project first, the Finkel's building piece of the project. But we left that till last for construction because we knew we needed these other spaces first. And the last one we were a little bit flexible with in what we wanted to do with it. We had an original design to do an outdoor courtyard theater space. And what I had originally estimated for it was $75,000. The space came back, became a priority to survive COVID. I went back and asked contractors and engineers to price that space again. When we couldn't do theater inside, said, okay, we've got this back lot that we wanted to do this thing in. I got $75,000. Tell me what it's going to cost me to do this. They came back and told me $250,000, which we didn't have if we wanted to do the other pieces of the project. So we couldn't afford the big back lot changeover, so we had opted to do what we had with the money we had. We took 3 years to create a courtyard theater. In 2020, we spent $30,000. We covered the asphalt parking lot with artificial turf, built a temporary stage, used scaffold to hang lights and sunshades from, rented a chain link fence and covered it with tarps. We did programming that year. The next year, we purchased a stage canopy to allow us to continue in a light rain, and we put up a new wooden fence. Every time rain was in the forecast, it was like, get the tarps out, climb the scaffold, put garbage bags over the lights, do everything we had. In 2022, we spent $10,000, we landscaped the space and added additional power. We made do with the funds that we had to keep going, and we would just kind of do it a little bit at a time. So this is a picture of the courtyard space in the back. On the top, you can see the canopy, top left. The front is the front of the building, which we didn't change at all. That's our entrance to the courtyard theater. The back of that building at 126, you can see the balcony. We gained 2 apartments in that. So Market House Theater now has 4 guest artist apartments. When we don't have guest designers or guest directors in those, we rent them out on Airbnb, and that brings us in $100,000 a year to support our programming. We have learned through all of this, you leverage every earned income opportunity you can get to help support the overall project of what you're trying to do. We had a $2 million new market tax credit that we had been working on for a couple of years. COVID eliminated that. We changed the design again to go back to the core basics of what we had to do to complete our project. If we had used the original plans and built the largest piece first, we would never have been able to accomplish any of the other stuff we did. So we had to go back to some of our previous donors when we didn't have enough money to finish that core thing, because the money came out and said, we can do the building, but you won't have any restrooms or air conditioning. So we went back to our previous donors and asked them to extend their pledge for one more year in order to get air conditioning and restrooms, and they agreed to that because we worked through that process with them and talked about that. We finished the next stage project in 2023. Remember, we started this in 2007. We added 7 buildings, 4 we purchased for $500,000, 3 were donated for a total of $300,000. Total pledges were $5.6 million, fundraising was $5.5 million in individual donations, and $100,000 in total grants. Everybody got, so you got grant money to do this. I'm like, no. These are individual donors in this community who supported this whole project. We got $75,000 from the National Endowment for the Arts to do an architectural survey, and $25,000 from the Delta Regional Authority to help us with a scene shop piece of that. Our campus is now 11 buildings, all owned and renovated with no debt. You can see the front on the top up there is where the corrugated tin front used to be, where that bay window is on the second floor. That was rebuilt to its original historic appearance. Next to it is the front of the courtyard theater space. So we own 120, 122, 124, and 126. We purchased the 124 and 126 as a part of the project. That corner building from the previous project is 132. On the top end over here is the front of the arcade theater, and most people would be hard-pressed to know where that building is. If you know where the Columbia Theater is, and the office building next door, the one-story office building, is the arcade theater office. At the back of it, turned sideways, is the arcade theater. You used to walk down the center of the office building to go to the entrance, which was in the middle of the arcade theater, to go and see it. And they had a balcony upstairs. Well, because we had been looking for storage space before we started the next stage project, we purchased that building right after the 2008 recession. The person who owned it wasn't able to develop it. So we made them an offer at half of the price they were trying to sell it for, and they said, okay. So we own that, and it's been used as a storage space since then. The building on the bottom left at the corner is the old Finkel's Fair Trade department store. The Finkel's family used to have that whole block for the most part. Each of those buildings they had cut doorways into. They kept expanding down that way. And it's funny because that building, I've seen pictures of it, used to be painted bright red. It's now pink. It's faded so much. And there are, the sign on the side of it, the sign painted thing, is one of the most photographed things from downtown Paducah from a historical perspective with that. I still have people who walk into that building going, is this the Finkel's shoe store? I'm like, no, it's not. It's the Market House Theater. In the front of that building, we have an event space, and in the back, we have our studio theater. And I'll show you some inside photos in a moment. The other building we got as a part of the project is the Harrison Street building. This was the ideal real building. When we were looking for, we were going to make that arcade theater up at the top. We were going to make that our scene shop and storage area. And I needed to find a temporary space for us to go to. So I went out into the community and got a real estate person and said, okay, can you show me some buildings that we might, do a short-term lease on? And they showed me that building, and I said, this is actually better than the building we want to renovate. What can I do? And we knew the owner of the building, and the woman who had owned the building, she was a Market House Theater supporter. And so we went to her, and we had asked her earlier in the campaign for a donation, but she was ill at that point, and so we backed off that ask. In the meantime, she passed away. And when I found out that her husband was the one who owned the building, I went to him and said, would you consider donating this to the theater? Because your wife loved the theater. He said, okay. So we gained the ideal real building, but it came with its own set of challenges. It was a metal building in the back of it that had no power, no nothing. It was just like a big metal storage kind of space that was connected to the old industrial part where they built piping for underwater divers to get their air through. That's the ideal reel. It was a reel that went on their belt and would go with them down. We walked into the building and the offices, it was interesting because the offices looked like somebody had closed the door one day and not come back because there was mail on the desk that hadn't been opened yet. The magazines and the thing were from, 5 years ago. It was like, it was just left there, and we went in and we thought, this is going to be great. Now, the inside of the building isn't conditioned at all. There's no air conditioning, no heat. The office has that, and what we did was we spent about $100,000 on the back section to create our scene shop, where we build our scenery. And now it is big enough, we actually created a floor on it so that it matches the theater, so we can build 2 shows at the same time now. We don't have to do just 1 show at a time. The other building, of course, is the Market House building. It is the only building we don't own. We lease it from the city for $1 a year. It's a historic landmark. And the city has told me that they will only give a 20-year lease on it, because anything longer than that becomes an issue with something else. So every 20 years, we have to go back to the city and get the lease renewed on that. We did have one more building, which I don't have pictures of. Sometimes you're in the right place at the right time for things to happen. I had a woman who called me on December 24th to go, I'd like to donate a building. I'm like, okay, can I look at the building? Can I see what kind of condition it's in? Sure. But she needed this done before December 31st because she had a capital gains thing at the end of the year. So I had 1 week plus 2 holidays in there. So I took some people with, we looked at the building. It is the 422 Broadway building, the old Watkins department store building. It's a 4-story concrete building, and it's solid. The structure is solid. It didn't have any heating and cooling inside. It had been taken out by a previous owner at some point to redo. The fuses in it, somebody had started electrical work in the back, but the inside still had the screw-in fuses on each floor with breakers next to those screw-in fuses. There was no sprinkler in it. So it was a gift, but when we looked at it, we were looking at probably $2 million to renovate that. So the theater decided to hang on to it for a little bit and decide whether we wanted to sell it to realize the gift or to develop it. And we hung on to it for a while, but if you go by it now, you'll see there's a for sale sign in the window for it because we're trying to realize the gift from that. Because for one thing, it was like, we just finished the other project. I'm not sure we want to go right back into another $2 million project with that. And we're not really sure how we would utilize that for what we would do. So we own 11 buildings and operate out of 12 buildings. Last year we produced, oh, did I go too far? There we go. Last year we produced over 26 shows and events, bringing in over $500,000 a year. We have classes in dance and theater, bringing in revenues of over $125,000 a year. We lease space to Lepa Jewelry Store. One of those front spaces, we went, this really isn't, configured right for us to utilize. How can we make some money on that to help support the program? We have 4 fully furnished apartments for guest artists and rent them on Airbnb, bringing in over $100,000 a year. We have a staff of 11 full-time and 9 part-time. We have contributed income, donations, sponsors, and grants of over $600,000 a year. And our operational budget this year is $1.3 million. It's enough to keep me up at night. But it's funny how things just kind of come. What we started out with, every time, and I so believe this is true, every time we were faced with a challenge, with something that was bad news, something that we didn't anticipate, something that was difficult, we went back and we re-looked at what the core thing we were trying to accomplish, the mission of it, and I think it made the projects better. Because we really had to be concise with how we were going to do things. 3 months after we officially finished the project, we received a $1 million unrestricted donation out of the blue. Some of the things that we had wanted to do, we just said we don't have the money to do this. And with the recent sale of CSI, we had someone who made a donation to us to realize some of that. We put half of it into reserve funds for our endowment, for maintenance and operational reserve accounts. The other half, we finished up some of those items we couldn't do in the big project because we didn't have the money. One of the things that we had wanted to do in the original project is on the Finkel's building, the 200 Kentucky Avenue building, there's transom windows across the front, which used to be there, and they had been covered over with red tin. We were able to go back and open those back up and re-put glass into those and make that building look back to what that historic look was for that. We are still working on the courtyard theater space, and we have the restaurant that was in there before had one tiny little restroom in one room and another restroom in the building next door to it. Well, when you add a courtyard theater space that can seat 300 people, having a single stall restroom is not very conducive. We also had other restrooms in other parts of the building, in our educational building, but trying to configure all that. So one of our next projects that we want to do is to do the restrooms for the courtyard space. And to me, that's kind of finishing off some of what we wanted to do with the next stage project. We also wanted to put an accessible entrance on the front of it, because there's a big step up if you come in where that tile wall is, there's a big step up into that space. We wanted to be able to have wheelchairs and walkers and other things come through that space. So adding a front doorway on that, adding a little bit more of outside lighting, more exits, do a little bit more landscaping, do some of those things to the back courtyard theater space. And having the courtyard space really has helped us a great deal. Let's see if I've got pictures. So there's the Finkel's sign on the side, and I have to tell you, people go, "You're not going to paint over that, are you?" Half the community goes, "You're not going to paint over that sign, are you?" The other half of the community goes, "You're going to paint over that sign, aren't you?" And historically, leave it. That's historic preservation, is leave it the way it is. So that is what we have promised the Finkel family. We will leave that. This is the inside of the studio theater, that one-story section at the back of it that we renovated. You can see that big beam that goes across there in that one picture on the left. That's where there used to be a two-story building, separated a wall. That whole building came down. Basically, we took it down below the foundation and rebuilt it in a way that opened that space up for us. So this is set up for the dinner theater shows. This space is a flexible space. This is what it looks like when we put our risers and seats in there. That was for Native Gardens, the show we did last year. So we can take out and reconfigure that space. In fact, we are getting ready for the comedy of Men in Cars about fathers and sons and their cars, and how the sons thought their dad was the smartest person in the world when they were growing up. Then as they got older, they went, well, maybe he's not so smart. And then as they got older, they went, maybe he really was smarter than I gave him credit for. So it's a really nice show, comedy. But we set up these seats for that. We'll do that October, I think it's the 12th through the 27th. The next week, right after that, we have Murder Mystery Dinner Theater in there with the tables and chairs. So everything comes out, we reconfigure the space, and we do the next show that we're going to do in there. This is the front space. There's lobby space to the left on the picture, and then the front event space that we have, which was where the department store was in front. That created a place for us to have receptions, and we rent that out for weddings. We have the Community Christian Academy is having their fall formal winter dance. They're using the back studio. We take everything out. They have their dance back in the studio theater space, and they put tables and chairs and have a formal dinner up front. So that's rented out for December. This is the front of the 208 Kentucky Avenue. This was a building that used to be an antique shop, and the roof had leaked for several years. And when you walked into it, when I first walked into it, you would get a headache after 5 minutes because there was so much mold in it. It had to be pretty much gutted to really be restored. The building next door, the 206, had been empty for many, many years. Somebody bought it, thought they were going to put a shop and an apartment upstairs, and then never quite realized that. That's where our entrance, this is where the front of those two buildings are. Inside of those buildings are dance studios. These are our dance studio classrooms. We have a large dance studio that's in the bottom left there, and then the smaller one is the top left there. There's a hallway that connects to the lobby, which you see in the bottom right picture. And that was our shared space with Harmony Road School of Music. These were some of the music classrooms that we had, and things change. You know, partners change, things change, and you always have to be ready for those things that you didn't expect to happen will happen, even after you get open. This is upstairs of 208. This is our costume shop. On the top left, you can see where they actually create the costumes. The entrance to the costume shop is that staircase, and there is a Lula lift at the bottom. It's not an elevator. It's a limited use, limited access lift. It's the kind of thing where you roll a rack of costumes in, you go upstairs, you get your cup of coffee, you look at something else, then you come back and you go, oh, is it up here yet? Okay. And then the 2 rooms there are storage rooms. We have 2 full rooms of costumes. So we have thousands of costumes in our storage. The front lobby that we did in the main theater was completed in 2019. And that you can see on the left, that's the entryway into where the seating is. You can kind of see we built a little bar section on the right with the doors there. We put video screens. It's cheaper to buy a video screen today than it is to have a sign printed and change it out every show. So we did that, and then you can see the really nice thing is we opened up that room. We got a lot of windows that opened up in the side of it, and you can see all that architectural detail up in the top of that. So that's what I have, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that the theater last year we did 45,000 student interactions. We have student programming in 3 states. We are in 30 different schools. Most of what we do is not in the Market House Theater in our education program. We use theater as a teaching tool to teach kids self-confidence, the ability to communicate their thoughts and their feelings so they can stand up in front of a group of people and not be shaking. You'd be surprised. I think they said that more people are afraid of public speaking than they are afraid of death. So it is trying to give people those tools to do that, and giving kids that, whether they go into theater or not, that's the kind of thing that gives you life skills and makes you successful in life. And that's what we use theater for, is to teach that. We did 26 shows and events last year. We have a touring show that goes to rural schools. It does a 30-minute musical with 4 actors in a van with the set. Some of the schools we go to, we are their only arts component. We drive an hour out into rural Western Kentucky and Southern Illinois. My favorite is one of the schools that had the dog laying by the door waiting for the kid to get out of class. You know, some of those schools are just really, they touch you because we're their arts programming. That's what Market House Theater does. We put on great shows. We did Fiddler on the Roof last June. We've got Little Shop of Horrors going with a performance next weekend. We've got 5 shows in rehearsal right now. We've got Playtime coming up on the 26th through the 28th. It's free. They're doing the 3 Little Pigs. It's for the Wiggle Giggle crowd. The 3 to 5-year-olds, they get to help tell the story, and they get a book to take home so they can read it. It's literacy, but it's also having the kids act out the story. And that's the most successful thing that we do. When we go into schools, kids acting out stuff is much more impactful than reading it in a book. When they have to be George Washington, when they have to act out these things, you learn those things as opposed to just reading about it.
Michael, thank you so much.
And I'll stay if you need to ask questions after that.